Raymond Cole, a forgotten war hero, stands trial for stealing a can of soup to survive another night. In a Tucson courtroom, Judge Michael Lane, hardened by routine, freezes upon seeing Raymond's name. A haunting recognition stirs. Raymond saved his life in Fallujah. As the truth unravels, the courtroom shifts from apathy to awe. Colonel Raines testifies to Raymond's bravery, exposing a nation's failure to its veterans. The charges loom, but so does a deeper question. Why does the judge look haunted? What secrets bind these men, and will justice rewrite Raymond's story before it's too late? Raymond's story shows heroes walk among us, often unseen. Support our channel to amplify these truths. Subscribe, share, and comment. Have you met a forgotten hero? Let's honor them together. Your thumbs up fuels our mission to inspire decency and justice. Join us in remembering those who served. In the sterile glow of the courtroom, the prosecutor's voice sliced through the stifling air, flat and devoid of warmth. Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a single can of soup from a local grocery. His eyes remained glued to the documents before him, as if the man standing in shackles was just another case number, another box to check. Raymond Cole, 67, stood hunched in the defendant's box, his gaunt frame drowning in a tattered jacket, its sleeves frayed like the edges of his life. His gray beard, thick and unruly, framed a face etched with the weariness of a man time had long since abandoned. His whispered words barely carried beyond the wooden railing. I just needed enough to get through one more night. The confession hung in the air, fragile and raw, a plea not for forgiveness but for understanding. A ripple of unease passed through the courtroom. Spectators shifted in their seats, some with pity flickering in their eyes, others with judgment hardening their expressions. A man in the back row let out a quiet scoff, as if Raymond's desperation was a personal insult to his sense of order. But the judge, perched behind his bench, remained motionless, his gaze locked on the file before him. His fingers gripped the edges of the pages, knuckles whitening as though the name printed there, Raymond Cole, carried a weight far heavier than the crime. Something stirred in the judge's weathered face, a tightening of the palm, a faint tremble in his hand. Slowly he rose, the creak of his chair piercing the silence. The room stilled, every breath held, as if sensing a story unfolding beyond the facts of the case. Who was this broken man in handcuffs, and why did the judge's eyes betray a man haunted by ghosts of a war long past? Outside, the Tucson sun sank behind the desert hills, painting the sky in hues of fire and ash. Long shadows stretched across the cracked pavement of a forgotten corner of the city, where a shuttered gas station stood like a relic of better days. Amid rusted metal, shattered glass, and faded graffiti, an old man stirred beneath a weather-stained tarp. Raymond Cole had made this desolate patch his refuge for nearly 3 months. At 67, his face was a canvas of hardship, carved with lines that spoke of relentless sun and endless nights. His gray beard framed a face like worn leather, and his oversized coat hung loosely on a body that seemed to shrink beneath the weight of survival. His army-issue boots, relics from a life decades gone, were split at the soles, exposing feet toughened by years of marching, first for his country, now for scraps. But it wasn't hunger or age that bowed his shoulders. It was the memories, heavy as iron, that clung to him like shadows he couldn't outrun. Each night, as the desert sky deepened, Raymond performed a quiet ritual. From a pocket near his heart, he drew a battered brass Zippo lighter, its surface scarred but gleaming faintly under the grime. One side bore the U.S. Army insignia, a symbol of a life he'd once lived with purpose. The other carried a faint inscription, "Keep moving forward." He didn't smoke, hadn't in years, but he'd flipped the lighter open and shut, the soft click a metronome to his thoughts. In the flicker of moonlight on steel, he searched for glimpses of a different life, one where he wasn't invisible, where his name still meant something, where his sacrifices hadn't been erased by time. The lighter was his last tether to that world, a fragile thread connecting him to the man he used to be. For 4 days, hunger had gnawed at Raymond's core, a relentless predator that grew bolder with each passing hour. He'd wandered the alleys behind diners, hoping for scraps tossed out in haste, and scoured trash bins behind convenience stores. But Tucson had turned its back on him. Luck, it seemed, had left him behind, just like everything else. That morning, as the pain in his stomach sharpened into something unbearable, He found himself outside a small grocery on Valencia Avenue. The family-owned store was a quiet haven, known for its fresh tortillas and a bulletin board crowded with community flyers. Inside, the cool air was a stark contrast to the desert's unrelenting heat, and the shelves, brimming with colorful cans and boxes, seemed to taunt him with their abundance, luxuries he could see but never touch. He paused at the door, his rough hand resting against the frame. Pride had always been his final stronghold, the one thing he clung to when everything else, his home, his savings, his place in the world, had slipped away. But hunger was a merciless foe, whispering that survival demanded surrender. With a heart heavy with shame, he stepped inside, moving with the quiet respect of someone who knew he was out of place. He didn't ask for charity. He didn't beg. He drifted through the aisles, eyes down, until he reached the back, where rows of canned goods stood like silent sentinels. His hand trembled as it hovered, then closed around a single can of chicken noodle soup. Store brand, unremarkable, but a promise of warmth for a man starved of it. He slipped it into his coat's inner pocket, the weight both a comfort and a curse. With his head bowed and his spirit hollow, he turned to leave. But the young cashier, barely old enough to shave, had been watching. Through the store's overhead mirror system, he'd caught the subtle motion of Raymond's hand. "Hey!" The boy's voice rang out, sharp with righteous anger. "Stop right there!" Raymond froze, his shoulders slumping under the weight of inevitability. He didn't run. He didn't lie. He stood still, a man who had long since accepted the cost of his choices. By the time the police arrived, a small crowd had gathered outside. Regulars, neighbors, and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle. Their whispers buzzed like a swarm, a mix of pity, curiosity, and condemnation, as they stared at the old man whose hunger had led him to this moment of reckoning. The cruiser's door creaked as two officers stepped onto the cracked pavement. Officer Daniels, a weathered man with a voice like gravel and years etched into the lines of his face, scanned the scene with a practiced eye. Beside him was Officer Rivera, barely a month out of the academy, his badge still gleaming with the optimism of someone who hadn't yet been worn down by the job. "Step away from the building," Daniels barked, his tone carrying the weight of countless similar nights. Raymond, a man whose frame seemed to shrink under the weight of his own existence, complied without a word. His tattered coat hung loosely, concealing the stolen can of soup nestled inside. As he moved, his wrists slid behind his back with an ease that spoke of resignation, as if he'd done this before, too many times. Rivera, securing the cuffs, couldn't help but notice how fragile those wrists were, thinner than seemed humanly possible, like brittle twigs beneath the worn fabric. As the cuffs clicked shut, Rivera's gaze caught on something glinting faintly at Raymond's neck. A pair of dog tags, their edges dull-darkened by time, the etched words nearly erased by years of wear. Curiosity softened Rivera's rookie sharpness. "You a vet?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. Raymond didn't meet his eyes. His head stayed bowed, his voice a low murmur, barely audible. "Used to be someone useful," he said, the words heavy with a grief that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than the moment. "Not anymore." The admission hung in the air, unanswered, as the officers led him to the cruiser. Rivera felt a pang he couldn't quite name. Pity, maybe, or the faint stirrings of respect for a man who carried a past he couldn't see. At the precinct, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a sterile glow over the processing room. Raymond sat motionless in a hard plastic chair, his hands folded in his lap, the cuffs now gone but their weight still lingering in his posture. A public defender, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, shuffled through papers and gave him 10 minutes of her divided attention. She spoke in clipped sentences, explaining the process with the detached efficiency of someone who'd seen too many cases like his. Raymond listened, nodded politely, and signed the form she slid across the table. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice carrying a sincerity that felt out of place in the cold room. No calls were made, no one was waiting for him, no one would come. On the booking form, under next of kin, the line remained blank, a silent testament to a life unmoored. As the sun sank behind the mountains, the holding cell grew dim, shadows pooling in the corners like spilled ink. Raymond sat with his back pressed against the cold concrete wall, his eyes closed, his lips moving in a whisper only he could hear. Just one more night, Maggie. Just one more, The words were a private ritual, a plea or a promise to someone long gone. No one in the cell block knew who Maggie was. No one asked. Outside, the world churned on. Cars honked, neon signs flickered to life, and people bickered over gas prices or debated weekend plans. But inside that cell, Raymond was a ghost, a man from nowhere with no one, who once stood tall for a nation that now passed him by without a glance. Morning came, and with it, the slow grind of the courtroom. The docket moved like a rusted machine, churning through petty cases, traffic violations, minor disputes, defendants who barely lifted their eyes from the floor. The courtroom's oak walls, once polished to a shine, were now dulled by decades of routine, bearing witness to the same tired cycle day after day. It was a place where hope came to stagnate, where nothing remarkable was expected, until the clerk's voice cut through the monotony. Case 7143, State of Arizona versus Raymond Cole, she announced, her tone flat, devoid of curiosity. Heads barely turned, just another vagrant, another petty charge. Raymond was led in, still wearing the same frayed coat from the night before, the can of soup long confiscated, but its absence still heavy in his pocket. His beard, tangled and untouched since the winter's chill, framed a face that seemed to carry the weight of too many sleepless nights. His eyes, sunken and shadowed, spoke of a man more familiar with the cold concrete of alleyways than the warmth of a bed. His hands, cuffed in front of him not for danger but for protocol, trembled slightly as he shuffled to the defense table. The young public defender assigned to him offered a distracted nod, her attention already drifting to the next case. "Just plead guilty, Mr. Cole," she whispered, her voice brisk. "First-time theft. You will be out by next week." Raymond didn't respond. He sat still, his silence louder than any plea, a man waiting not for justice but for the world to forget him entirely. On the bench, Judge Michael Lane presided, his salt and pepper hair catching the courtroom's dim light. In his early 60s, he carried the air of a man who'd seen it all, strict but not cruel, efficient but not heartless. His sharp gaze discouraged small talk, and his reputation for clearing dockets quickly was well earned. The prosecutor, a young man with an eager edge, stood with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Your Honor," Puig began, his voice crisp, "the defendant was caught on surveillance stealing a can of soup from a local grocer. He has no fixed address, no employment, and a prior record of misdemeanor trespass. The state recommends continued detention until formal charges can be reviewed." It was a routine speech delivered with the certainty of a case already closed. But then Judge Lane's eyes flicked down to the case file, and something shifted. His brow furrowed just slightly as he lingered on the page longer than usual. The room didn't notice, but for Raymond, sitting in the shadow of his own silence, the truth was just beginning to stir. A truth that might unravel the story of a man who'd been invisible for far too long. The day had started like any other for Judge Michael Lane, a monotonous blur of paperwork and protocol. Names, H's, charges. They all flowed past him in a predictable rhythm, each case a fleeting moment in the grind of the judicial system. He sat at his bench, flipping through the latest file with practiced detachment, his pen poised to jot down notes. Then his eyes snagged on a name, Raymond Elias Cole. The world seemed to tilt. His breath hitched, and his gaze darted back to the page, rereading the name as if it might vanish. His fingers tightened around the file, knuckles whitening, as a faint hum stirred deep in his mind. A spark of memory clawing its way up from a past he'd long buried beneath years of civilian life. Could it be him? The question hung heavy, unanswered, as his heart began to race. He flipped to the property form, his eyes scanning the arresting officer's notes. There, amid the mundane list of belongings, was a detail that stopped him cold. A military dog tag, its surface worn nearly smooth by time, but still wearing the faint inscription, Cole R. Michael's chest tightened. His throat closed around a sharp inhale, and for the first time that morning, he truly looked at the man seated before him. Raymond Elias Cole sat in the defendant's chair, his frame gaunt and weathered, his face etched with the deep lines of a life that had not been kind. His hair was thinning, gray streaking through what had once been dark, and his eyes, those same dark, steady eyes, held a quiet resignation. Handcuffs glinted dully around his wrists, chaining him to this moment, to this courtroom, to a charge so trivial it was almost absurd: theft of a single can of soup. Yet to Michael, this man was no stranger. He was a ghost from a battlefield, a figure forged in the crucible of war. Raymond Cole was the man who had once carried a bleeding, half-conscious medic, Michael himself, 2 miles through a hail of enemy fire outside Fallujah, the man who had saved his life. The courtroom faded around Michael, its sounds muffled as if underwater. The prosecutor's closing remarks droned on, but the words barely registered. To his left, a cough broke the air. Somewhere behind him, a low chuckle rippled through the gallery, as if the irony of a man in chains over a can of soup was some kind of grim joke. But Michael didn't laugh. His jaw clenched so tightly it ached, a vein throbbing at his temple as a storm of emotions churned within him. Gratitude, guilt, disbelief, and a searing sense of injustice. How had it come to this? How could a hero, a man who had risked everything, end up here diminished and defeated by the very world he'd fought for? He rose from the bench, the motion slow and deliberate, as if the weight of the past pressed against his shoulders. The act was so rare, so out of character for the composed Judge Lane, that a hush fell over the courtroom. The bailiff froze mid-step, his hand hovering near his belt. The prosecutor paused, his papers slipping slightly in his grip as he glanced up, startled. Every eye in the room fixed on Michael, sensing something momentous but unable to name it. "Court will recess for 15 minutes, he announced, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of emotion that no one could quite decipher. Without another word, without so much as a glance toward Raymond, he turned and strode through the side door, past the chamber hallway, and into the sanctuary of his private office. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the world. He stood motionless in the center of the room, staring at the floor as Raymond's name echoed in his mind like the reverberation of a distant explosion. The office was a study in order, polished wood, neatly framed certificates, and rows of legal texts. But none of it mattered now. It was all backdrop, meaningless against the tidal wave of memory crashing over him. His legs felt unsteady as he moved toward a cabinet tucked in the corner, his hand trembling slightly as he opened a narrow drawer labeled Service Archives. Most judges kept case law or academic journals. Michael kept relics of a different life: faded newspaper clippings, dog-eared photographs, and military records lay carefully preserved, fragments of a time when he was not Judge Lane, but Private First-Class Michael Lane, Army Field Medic. His fingers brushed over a black and white photograph, its edges yellowed and curling. He lifted it carefully, as if it might crumble under his touch. The image captured a moment seared into his soul. A younger Michael, barely 20, stood beside a sandbag wall, his face pale and streaked with sweat. In the background, smoke curled skyward, and the faint shapes of soldiers moved through the case of a war zone. But at the center of the frame was the man he could never forget, a tall, broad-shouldered sergeant in dusty fatigues, his dark eyes fierce with determination. Raymond Cole. One hand gripped Michael's arm, dragging him through the dirt. The other clutched a rifle, ready to fend off the enemy closing in. Michael could still hear his voice, deep and unshaken despite the gunfire tearing through the air. "You're not dying here, kid. Not today." He sank into his chair, the photograph trembling in his hands. He had never known Raymond's full name. Cole had never lingered for praise or medals, never filed the after-action reports that might have earned him recognition. He had vanished back into the grind of duty, a fleeting savior who left no trace, until now. Michael's chest ached with the weight of it all: gratitude for the life Raymond had given him, guilt for the years he'd spent unaware of the man's fate, and anger, raw, burning anger that a hero could fall so far, reduced to scavenging for survival in a world that had forgotten him. Back in the courtroom, Raymond sat motionless, his cuffed hands resting in his lap. He didn't fidget or glance around. He didn't ask why the judge had stared at him with such intensity, why the room had gone silent, why the proceedings had halted so abruptly. He didn't need to. Deep in his core, a flicker of recognition stirred, a memory as vivid as it was painful. He could still feel the weight of a young medic slung over his shoulder, the sting of smoke in his lungs, the slick warmth of blood soaking through his fatigues. He could still hear his own voice, hoarse and desperate, shouting through the chaos. "Keep your eyes open. Stay with me." That young man, barely clinging to life, had been Michael Lane. And now, decades later, that same man sat on the bench, cloaked in the authority of a judge, and had just stood for him. Raymond's gaze drifted to the empty bench, his expression unreadable. His heart beat steadily, but beneath the calm surface, a quiet turmoil churned. He hadn't thought of Fallujah in years, had buried those memories under layers of survival, of scraping by in a world that seemed to have no place for him. Yet in that moment, as the courtroom waited in suspended silence, he felt the past reach out, bridging the gap between who he had been and who he was now. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as a vagrant, not as a thief, but as the man he had once been. In his office, Michael set the photograph down, his hands steadying as he took a deep breath. The past had caught up with him, unyielding and undeniable. Raymond Elias Cole was no longer just a name on a file. He was the man who had given Michael a future. And now, in this fleeting moment of power, Michael had a chance to repay that debt. He didn't know how, not yet, but as he rose from his chair, resolve hardened in his chest. The courtroom awaited, and with it, a reckoning. Not just for a can of soup, but for a life that deserved far more than it had been given. Michael settled into his worn office chair, the leather creaking under his weight as he flipped open his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a faint tremor betraying the anticipation coiling in his chest. He logged into the VA's secure database, a privilege granted from his days volunteering at veteran legal clinics, where he'd seen countless stories of sacrifice and struggle flicker across the screen. With deliberate care, he typed in the dog tag number scrawled on the arrest form, each keystroke echoing with purpose. The system hummed, then delivered its verdict. A match, Raymond Elias Cole, born April 2nd, 1956, United States Army, Sergeant First Class at discharge, service spanning from 1976 to 2006. Deployments, 2 in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Medals, a Bronze Star, an Army Commendation Medal, 4 Good Conduct Medals. Specialization, tactical logistics, high-risk convoy operations, emergency extraction. Michael leaned closer, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. This wasn't just a record. It was a testament to a life of quiet valor. Raymond Cole wasn't an ordinary soldier. He was a man who'd navigated the chaos of war, orchestrating supply lines through hostile terrain, pulling men and women from the jaws of death without ever seeking the spotlight. Michael's eyes lingered on the screen, his mind racing with admiration and a creeping sense of unease. He scrolled through mission logs, incident reports, and citations, each entry painting a picture of a man who'd given everything and asked for nothing. Then, a report from Fallujah, July 2003, stopped him dead. His breath caught as he read. Sergeant Cole had driven a battered transport vehicle straight into an active combat zone, drawing enemy fire away from a stranded medical unit. Shrapnel had torn into his leg and shoulder, but he hadn't stopped. He'd evacuated 2 injured medics under a hail of bullets, one identified only as PFCM-ill. That medic had survived because of Cole's relentless courage. Michael exhaled, a shaky laugh escaping his lips. The memory of that day flooded back, vivid and unrelenting. The heat, the dust, the deafening crack of gunfire. He'd been that PFC, bleeding out in the dirt, certain he'd never see another sunrise. The chaos had swallowed him whole, fear clawing at his insides, until a voice, calm, steady, unbreakable, had cut through the panic. He'd clung to that voice, to the hands that dragged him to safety, never knowing the name of the man who'd saved him. For years, he'd replayed that moment, wondering if he'd imagined his rescuer, a ghost born of trauma and gratitude. Now that ghost had a name, and that name was sitting in a Tucson courtroom, charged with stealing a can of soup. The weight of 2 decades pressed against Michael's chest, heavy as the desert sun. He stared at the ceiling, grappling with the absurdity of it all. Raymond Cole, a man who'd carried lives out of hell, reduced to scraping by on the streets. Michael's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk, anger and guilt twisting in his gut. How had the system failed someone like this? How had he, Michael Lane, a man who owed his life to Cole, not known? He reached for his desk phone, his hand steady despite the storm inside him, and dialed a number he hadn't touched in over 10 years. The line crackled, and a gruff voice answered. "Colonel Thomas Raines." "Tom, it's Mike Lane." His voice was soft, almost reverent, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the moment. A pause, then a low chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned. Mike Lane calling me out of the blue. Haven't heard from you since Fort Hood. What's going on?" Michael swallowed, his throat tight. "I found him, Tom. Raymond Cole. He's here in Tucson." He hesitated, shame creeping into his voice. "He's homeless. Arrested yesterday." Silence stretched across the line, heavy and thick. Raines finally spoke, his voice quieter now, laced with disbelief. "Raymond saved half a platoon in Fallujah, including you. He just vanished after that. The VA lost track of him after 2008. Michael's jaw clenched. "I owe him everything," he said, the words barely above a whisper. He glanced at the old photo on his desk, one he'd kept all these years, a grainy snapshot of his unit, with Cole standing off to the side, his face half hidden but unmistakable. "You still have that photo?" Raines asked. "I'm looking at it right now," Michael replied, his thumb brushing over the faded edges. "I need your help, Tom. I need an affidavit from the old unit. I'll call the Pentagon myself if I have to. We can't let him slip away again." "I'll get it to you," Raines promised, his tone firm. Then after a beat, he added, "We all thought he was dead, Mike. Most heroes don't just disappear unless they're broken." That word, broken, hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. Michael ended the call and sat back, the silence of his office swallowing him. Broken. He turned it over in his mind, the weight of it settling into his bones. He pulled up Raymond's VA file again, scrolling through the sparse details. Benefits terminated in 2009. Non-response to correspondence. An address that hadn't been updated since before the economic crash. No disability claims. No pension withdrawals. No request for mental health support. Nothing. It was as if Raymond had stepped off the field and into oblivion, erased the moment his country no longer needed him. Michael's eyes stung as he imagined Cole's life unraveling, his wife's death, the loss of his anchor, the slow drift into invisibility. He pictured Raymond wandering Tucson streets, a man who'd once faced death without flinching, now reduced to surviving on scraps, his medals gathering dust in some forgotten storage unit. Michael printed the report, the printer's hum a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. He folded the pages with care, tucking them into the court file labeled State of Arizona versus Raymond Cole. But as he looked at the file, he wasn't just a judge staring at a case number. He was a soldier again, young and terrified, bleeding in the sand, saved by a man who'd asked for nothing in return. His fingers lingered on the folder, a silent vow forming in his heart. Raymond Cole had carried him once. Now it was Michael's turn to carry him back. The courtroom buzzed with a restless energy, but it wasn't the usual hum of a mundane shoplifting case. Something profound had shifted, like the air itself was holding its breath. When Judge Michael Lane re-entered through the side door, he didn't carry the detached demeanor of a man presiding over a petty theft. His shoulders were squared, his steps deliberate, as though he'd just unearthed a truth too monumental to leave behind in his chambers. The weight of it seemed to carve new lines into his face, his jaw clenched, his eyes burning with a clarity that hadn't been there before. As the bailiff called for all to rise, the room obeyed, not out of habit, but out of instinct. Something in Judge Lane's presence demanded it. He didn't sit at the bench right away. Instead, he stood, gripping a file folder in his left hand, its thickness starkly different from the slim packet he'd carried earlier. His gaze didn't flicker to the prosecutor, who was already shuffling papers nervously, or to the defense attorney, who looked equally puzzled. No, his eyes locked onto the man in handcuffs, sitting quietly at the defendant's table. Raymond Cole's head was slightly bowed, his expression unreadable, as though he'd long since accepted the world's indifference. But in that moment, Judge Lane saw him, really saw him, and the intensity of that recognition rippled through the room. "Court is back in session," the bailiff declared, his voice cutting through the tension. Judge Lane's voice followed, steady but laced with an authority that silenced even the softest whispers. "I have reviewed additional documentation concerning the defendant," he said, holding up the folder. "This information may fundamentally alter the course of these proceedings." The young prosecutor, barely out of law school, blinked in confusion, her hands frozen mid-motion over her notes. "Your Honor, I wasn't informed of any new documentation," she stammered, her voice tinged with a mix of frustration and unease. Judge Lane raised a hand, silencing her without effort. "You weren't," he said simply. "The documentation was delivered during the recess." He opened the folder with a deliberate slowness, each movement heavy with purpose. "Before any ruling is made, this court will hear testimony regarding the defendant's background." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Testimony? For a shoplifting case? The word felt absurd, out of place, like a grand gesture in a scene too small to hold it. Then the rear door of the courtroom creaked open, and the murmurs died instantly. Three men stepped inside, their military dress uniforms crisp and commanding. Their boots echoed softly against the polished floor, each step a testament to discipline and duty. The tallest among them, a man with gray hair and a chest adorned with 4 rows of commendations, moved with a quiet authority toward the witness stand. The other 2 stood at attention near the door, their faces unyielding. The room seemed to shrink in their presence, as though their collective history carried a gravity that bent the space around them. Judge Lane's voice broke the silence. "Please state your name and rank for the record." The man straightened, his posture flawless. "Colonel Thomas Raines, United States Army, retired." "And your relationship to the defendant?" Lane asked, his voice soft but firm, probing for a connection that would anchor the testimony to come. He paused, his eyes shifting briefly to Raymond, a fleeting moment where pride and sorrow in his gaze locked onto the man he'd once known so well. "I served with Sergeant First Class Raymond Cole during multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan," he said, his voice steady yet warm. "I was his commanding officer." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. The prosecutor shifted in her seat, her confidence eroding. The defense attorney's pen froze mid-scribble. Even the spectators, who'd come expecting a routine hearing, leaned forward, sensing the story unfolding was far bigger than the charge at hand. Judge Lane leaned forward, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute unwavering. "Colonel, you may proceed." He turned, his gaze sweeping not just to the judge's entire room, but to every soul present. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of memory, of battles fought and brothers lost. "This man," he began, gesturing toward Raymond, who sat motionless, his cuffed hands resting on the table, "once drove a burning Humvee through a hail of enemy fire to pull 3 wounded soldiers out of a kill zone. Shrapnel tore into his side, his shoulder, his leg, but he refused evacuation. He stayed until every last man was accounted for, dragging them to safety with his own hands." He paused, letting the image settle into the minds of those listening. He didn't do this once. He did it multiple times. Mission after mission, he put himself between death and his men. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat. His gaze swept the gallery, his dulcet voice growing softer but no less commanding. In one of those missions, he carried a young field medic, bleeding unconscious, over 2 miles through hostile territory to reach safety. That medic survived. He turned to Judge Lane, his eyes locking with the judge's. That medic's name was Michael Lane. A collective gasp swept through the room, shocked the room. Every eye turned to the bench where Judge Lane sat, his face still, but his hands gripping the edges of the table folder tightly. For a moment, he was no longer a judge. He seemed not a judge, but a soldier, caught in the echo of a debt he could never repay. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "That is correct," he said, his voice quiet but resolute steady. The revelation struck like lightning, shocked the room, illuminating it in stark clarity. Raymond Cole lifted his head, his eyes widening with shock and recognition. For the first time he looked at Judge Lane, not as a defendant facing a judge, but as a man seeing a piece of his past, a comrade brother from a battlefield long left behind. His lips parted, but no words came. The weight of that shared history hung between them, unspoken but heavy palpable. He continued, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet anger. For the past 15 years, Mr. Cole's military pension and benefits have been suspended due to a bureaucratic mistake error. He was left with nothing, no income, no housing, no access to mental health care. He faced the world alone, carrying scars both physical visible and mental unseen. And yet he never once complained. He never sought pity. He never asked for what was rightfully his. The colonel's words were a quiet indictment, not just of the system that had failed him, Raymond, but of a society world that had forgotten him. The prosecutor, her face pale, sank slowly into her chair, her notes forgotten. The defense attorney stared at Raymond, his expression a mix of awe and guilt for not knowing the man he'd been assigned to defend. The gallery was a sea of stunned faces, some glistening with tears, others hardened with shame. Judge Lane's voice, when he spoke again, was softer, almost reverent. "When I first saw Mr. Cole yesterday, I didn't recognize him," he admitted, his gaze fixed on Raymond. "War changes faces. It etches lines where there were none, dulls eyes that once burned with purpose. But it does not erase sacrifice. It does not diminish the courage of a man who gave everything and asked for nothing in return." Raymond's shoulders trembled slightly, the first crack in his stoic facade. His hands, still cuffed, clenched into fists, not in anger, but in an effort to hold himself together. In that moment, he wasn't just a defendant. He was a soldier, a hero, a man who'd carried the weight of others' lives and now bore the weight of their recognition. The courtroom, once a place of judgment, had become a place of reckoning, not for Raymond, but for everyone else. In the hushed stillness of the courtroom, Judge Lane's voice carried a weight that seemed to anchor the room itself. He turned his gaze to Raymond Cole, a man whose weathered frame bore the marks of a life both heroic and forgotten. "Mr. Cole," the judge said, his tone steady yet laced with an emotion that quivered at the edges, "please approach the bench." Raymond rose, his movements slow and deliberate, as though each step tested the reality of the moment. The cold steel of the shackles binding his wrists clinked softly, a reminder of the chains, both literal and metaphorical, that had tethered him for years. His eyes, shadowed by years of hardship, flickered with disbelief. Was this truly happening? Could a courtroom, a place that had so often judged him harshly, now be the stage for something different? His heart, hardened by years of solitude, dared not hope, but a faint spark of possibility stirred within him. "You saved my life," Judge Lane said, his voice low, meant only for those closest to hear, yet it reverberated with a sincerity that silenced the room. The judge's eyes, usually sharp and commanding, softened as they met Raymond's. "In this courtroom, this nation owes you a debt far greater than it has ever acknowledged." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. He turned to the prosecutor, a young man whose polished suit and confident demeanor faltered under the gravity of the moment. "Do you wish to proceed with the charges?" The prosecutor swallowed hard, his throat tight with the realization that the case he'd prepared was unraveling. He glanced at Raymond, then back at the judge, his mind racing. The evidence was clear: petty theft, a loaf of bread, a desperate act, but the man before him was no ordinary defendant. "The state moves to dismiss, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but tinged with deference. "With prejudice." "So ordered," Judge Lane replied, his gavel descending with a gentleness that belied its authority. The soft tap echoed through the courtroom, a sound that marked not just the end of a case, but the beginning of something far more profound. All charges against Sergeant Raymond Cole were dismissed. The room did not burst into applause. Such a display would have felt trivial, inadequate for the moment. Instead, a deep, reverent silence settled over the crowd. One by one, the spectators rose to their feet, not because the session had ended, but because they stood in the presence of a man they had misunderstood, misjudged, and overlooked. Raymond Cole, once invisible on the streets, dismissed as a vagrant, was now seen for who he truly was: a soldier, a hero, a man who had carried burdens none of them could fully comprehend. The silence was their acknowledgement, their apology, their respect. Raymond stood frozen near the bench, the shackles still encircling his wrists like a lingering accusation. His body hadn't yet caught up with the moment. His mind struggled to trust it. For years, he'd lived in the margins, blending into the gray blur of city sidewalks, dodging the pitying or scornful glances of strangers, carrying the weight of a life no one bothered to ask about. The sudden attention, the warmth in the judge's voice, the quiet reverence of the room, it felt like a dream he didn't dare believe. "Remove the cuffs," Judge Lane said, his voice soft but firm. The bailiff hesitated for a fleeting second, as though the command itself needed confirmation. Then he stepped forward, his keys jingling as he unlocked the shackles. The steel fell to the courtroom floor with a quiet clink, a sound that resonated like thunder in Raymond's chest. He rubbed his wrist slowly, the skin raw not from the cuffs, but from years of tension he'd never allowed himself to release. Years of clutching plastic bags filled with meager belongings, trash bags to shield him from the rain, sleeping bags to keep him warm in the cold nights of anonymity. Years of holding in grief, pain, and memories no one had ever cared to unearth. "Mr. Cole," Judge Lane said again, his voice now carrying a note of humility that seemed to surprise even himself. "There's someone here who's been trying to mind you." The rear doors of the courtroom creaked open, and a woman in her 30s stepped inside. Her plain clothes did nothing to diminish the urgency in her stride, the quiet determination in her eyes. She scanned the room, her gaze darting from face to face until it landed on Raymond. Tears welled up instantly, shimmering in the dim light of the courtroom. "Uncle Ray," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of years of searching, of longing, of hope that had never fully faded. Raymond turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as recognition dawned. "Rebecca," he said, his voice cracking like dry earth under the first rain. It had been over a decade since they'd last seen each other, since the funeral of his late wife, Margaret, when he'd slipped away into the shadows without a word. Rebecca, Margaret's niece, had refused to let him vanish completely. She'd scoured online forums, called the VA, visited shelters, and followed every faint lead, only to find nothing. Raymond had made himself a ghost, not because he didn't want to be found, but because he couldn't bear to be seen, not as the broken man he'd become. But now, standing before her, he felt like a man rising from the ashes of his own life. Rebecca didn't hesitate. She crossed the room in a few swift steps and wrapped her arms around him, her head pressed against his chest, tears soaking into his worn jacket. Raymond stood rigid at first, his arms hovering uncertainly. He didn't know how to hold her, how to accept this sudden flood of connection after years of isolation. Then slowly his arms encircled her, tentative at first, then tighter, as though anchoring himself to this moment, to her. For the first time in years, he wasn't holding on to survive. He was holding on to someone who remembered him, not the vagrant, not the thief, but Uncle Ray, the man who had once laughed with her at family dinners, who had carried her on his shoulders when she was small, who had loved Margaret with a quiet, unshakable devotion. Behind them, another figure moved through the crowd, his steps hesitant but purposeful. Mr. Hernandez, the grocery store owner who had called the police, stopped a few feet away. His face was a map of conflicting emotions: regret, shame, and something like awe. He had seen only a thief that day in his store, a man desperate enough to steal a loaf of bread. But now, standing in the courtroom, he saw Raymond Cole for who he truly was. His hands fidgeted as though searching for words he wasn't sure he had the right to speak. He had set this moment in motion, but not in the way he'd expected. The weight of his decision pressed heavily on him, and yet, in this moment, he felt a quiet gratitude that he had been part of something larger, something redemptive. The courtroom remained still, the echo of the gavel long faded, but the moment lingered, heavy with meaning. For Raymond, it was the first time in years he felt seen, not as a shadow on the street, but as a man with a past, a story, a heart that still beat despite everything. For Rebecca, it was the end of a long, lonely search, and the beginning of a reunion she dreamed of. And for those who watched, it was a reminder that heroes sometimes walk among us, unnoticed, until a moment like this strips away the labels and reveals the truth beneath. Raymond stood a few feet from Mr. Hernandez, his gaze fixed on the floor, heavy with a shame that seemed to anchor him to the spot. His voice, barely above a whisper, carried the weight of regret. "I didn't see you," he murmured, the words trembling with sincerity. All I saw was another issue and another person trying to take something that wasn't theirs. Raymond didn't meet his eyes with anger or resentment. Instead, a quiet, almost tender understanding softened his expression. He'd grown used to being invisible, a shadow in a world that rarely paused to look twice. Most people don't, he replied gently, his tone free of judgment. It's okay. But it wasn't okay for Mr. Hernandez. His voice cracked, betraying the storm of guilt swirling within him. No, he said, the words sharp with conviction. It's not. His hand trembled as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of paper, a handwritten note, and a check. He held them out, his eyes glistening with something between remorse and resolve. We're starting a fund, he said, his voice steadier now, to help other veterans who've been overlooked, who've fallen through the cracks. It's in your name, Raymond. I hope it's a step toward making things right. Raymond stared at the paper in his hands, his breath catching. It wasn't just the check that stunned him. It was the weight of what it represented. Not money, but acknowledgement, a recognition of his existence, his sacrifices, his story. For so long, he'd been a ghost, drifting through a system that seemed to have forgotten him. Now, in this small gesture, he felt the stirrings of something he hadn't known in years. Dignity. Within hours, the story of the courtroom's reversal exploded across local news outlets, quickly spiraling into national headlines. Homeless veteran cleared of charges. After judge recognizes him as wartime hero. The image of Raymond standing beside the judge's bench, his weathered face etched with quiet strength, became an emblem of a larger truth, one that sparked a national conversation. Donations poured in, not just from Tucson, but from across the country. Veterans organizations rallied, launching campaigns in Raymond's name. Old comrades, men who'd served under him decades ago, began to emerge, their voices breaking the silence of time as they shared stories of his courage, his leadership, his humanity. Each tale was a thread, weaving Raymond back into the fabric of a world that had once let him slip away. But nothing compared to what happened the following week. At a Veterans Memorial Ceremony in downtown Tucson, a crowd of hundreds gathered, young recruits with stars in their eyes, grizzled Vietnam survivors with scars both visible and hidden, families clutching photos of loved ones lost to war. The air was thick with solemnity as Judge Lane took the podium, his words measured and deliberate. Mid-sentence he paused, his eyes flickering toward the side entrance. A hush fell over the crowd as the doors swung open. Raymond Cole stepped forward. This time, there were no handcuffs, no shame, no shadows clinging to him. He wore a clean suit, borrowed from a local foundation, the fabric slightly stiff but dignified. His shoes pinched his feet, ill-fitting and worn, but he walked with a quiet pride that seemed to lift him taller than he'd stood in years. As he approached the podium, every soldier in the crowd rose to their feet, unprompted, their hands snapping to their brows in a salute that needed no command. It was a gesture born of respect, earned through decades of quiet endurance. Raymond stood before them, no longer a forgotten figure, but a man reclaimed by his own history. And this time the nation was watching. It would have been easy for Raymond to fade back into the shadows. The VA had offered him a small apartment, a place to live out his days with a roof over his head and food in the pantry. The world could move on, and he could let it. After all, he'd never asked for the spotlight, not the reporters camped outside his door, not the applause that followed him, not the cameras that seemed to chase his every step. But something had shifted deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Not as a problem to be solved, not as a burden to be managed, but as a man with a story worth telling, a life worth living. The weight of invisibility had lifted, and in its place was a spark of purpose he hadn't known he still possessed. So Raymond chose a different path. He didn't seek out the reporters or the politicians clamoring for his attention. Instead, he went to high schools, community centers, and veterans shelters, places where people gathered not for headlines, but for truth. He didn't deliver polished speeches or chase applause. He told stories, raw, unfiltered stories of soldiers who came home to battles no one could see, of friends who lost more than their bodies in war, of the deafening silence that greets a hero when the parades end and the world stops asking who they are. His voice wasn't loud or theatrical. It was steady, weathered, lived in, and people listened. To a group of teenagers one afternoon, he said, "I don't tell these stories to make you feel something. I tell them because one day, someone you love might come back from a war you'll never see. And when they do, they'll need more than a thank you. They'll need you to see them." The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking into young hearts that had never known war but now understood its shadow. Tucson didn't just listen, it acted. With rare bipartisan unity, the city council voted to establish the Raymond Cole Initiative, a fund dedicated to providing legal aid, transitional housing, and mental health support for veterans who, like Raymond, had been left behind. It was more than a program. It was a promise, a commitment to see those who had served, to ensure no one else slipped through the cracks. Raymond stood at the heart of it, not as a symbol, but as a man whose quiet resilience had reminded a city and a nation what it means to truly honor those who give everything. On a sun-drenched Memorial Day in Tucson, a crowd gathered to witness the unveiling of a new Veteran Support Center, its bronze plaque gleaming with a simple yet profound inscription: "Kindness isn't too late. It just needs someone patient enough to wait for it." These words, born from Raymond Cole's heart in his first public statement, now stood as a beacon of hope for countless others. Raymond himself lingered quietly among the onlookers, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, his eyes tracing the slow ascent of the American flag hoisted by young cadets. The murmurs of the crowd carried his name, a name that had once been lost to the shadows of America's streets but now resonated with purpose. He had no desire to step into the spotlight, no urge to snip a ceremonial ribbon or deliver a speech from a polished podium. For Raymond, standing there feeling the weight of the moment was enough. His heart swelled with a quiet pride, not for himself but for what this place represented, a chance for others like him to reclaim what time and circumstance had stolen. Inside the center, a hallway stretched out, its walls a tapestry of memory and honor. Framed photographs told stories that words could never fully capture. One image showed a young Raymond, his face etched with determination, carrying wounded soldiers through the chaos of a battlefield, his strength a lifeline in a world unraveling. Another captured his late wife, Margaret, her smile radiant on their wedding day, a moment of joy that still warmed Raymond's soul even as grief lingered like a soft ache. Other photos immortalized veterans who, like him, had slipped through society's cracks, men and women who had served with courage only to vanish into the forgotten corners of a nation that owed them everything. At the hallway's entrance, one photograph demanded attention. A judge in solemn black robes shaking hands with an older man in a wrinkled coat, his posture humble but unbroken. No caption adorned the frame, for none was needed. By now, the story of Raymond and the judge who saw beyond his tattered exterior had woven itself into the fabric of Tucson's collective memory. In the months that followed, Raymond chose to remain in Tucson, a city that had become more than a backdrop. It was home. His niece, Rebecca, became a constant presence, her visits filling his modest apartment with laughter and stories that bridged the years they'd spent apart. Her eyes sparkled with admiration for the uncle she'd rediscovered, a man whose quiet resilience had reshaped her understanding of strength. Neighbors, too, embraced Raymond as one of their own, stopping by with bags of groceries or settling into his worn armchair to share coffee and conversation. Their kindness wasn't born of pity, but of respect, a recognition of the man behind the story. Yet, despite the warmth of these connections, Raymond still cherished his solitary evening walks. As the desert air cooled and the sky ignited with stars, he'd wander the quiet streets, his steps unhurried, his thoughts drifting. Some nights, he'd pull out his old Zippo lighter, its scratched surface a relic of battles long past. Flicking it open, he'd hold the tiny flame aloft, its glow a silent tribute to the life he'd lived and the victories he'd earned. Not on the battlefield, but in the war to reclaim his dignity. His smile in those moments wasn't for the chaos he'd survived, but for the peace he'd found, a peace that whispered that his name mattered again. Raymond's journey wasn't defined by the clamor of gunfire or the spectacle of heroism, but by the quiet, stubborn reclamation of a place in the world. In a society that seemed to accelerate with every passing day, his story was a gentle admonition to pause, to look closer, to see the humanity in those too often overlooked. How many people, like Raymond, did we pass each week without a second glance? The man sitting alone on a park bench, his eyes tracing memories no one asked about. The woman pushing a cart heavy with her belongings, her pride unbroken despite her burdens. The figure rifling through a bin, their story hidden beneath layers of hardship. What if behind those eyes lay a history of sacrifice, of service, of silent strength that had shaped the world we took for granted? Raymond had never sought pity, nor had he demanded recognition. He'd asked for nothing at all, but dignity he'd shown wasn't something to be earned or pleaded for. It was a birthright, one that should be offered freely, without hesitation. This story wasn't just about a courtroom revelation or the unexpected unearthing of a hero. It was a mirror, reflecting our own lives, forcing us to confront the faces we'd forgotten and the stories we'd failed to hear. It challenged us to dwell on guilt, but to act with intention, to honor those who had overlooked by seeing them now. Raymond's journey was a testament to the quietest voices, the ones that carried the loudest truths, often needed only a listener to amplify them. His life, etched into the walls of a veteran center, written in the hearts of those who knew him, was a call to remember, not just the veterans, but anyone whose name had been erased by time or indifference. It was a reminder that second chances, decency, and justice were still possible, if only we were patient enough to extend them.